As the Final Fantasy franchise grew out from its humble beginnings, with each new iteration, the developers were encouraged to enhance existing elements and explore the benefits of new ones. This relentless drive to improve led to the job system undergoing significant improvements, and the same stance was taken for each game's narrative development. Fresh methods were also introduced for powering up the chosen protagonists and providing extra utility in combat, and one such example was seen in Final Fantasy V through the use of accessories, which could increase stats and grant immunity to negative status ailments. Final Fantasy VI enhanced this particular notion through the relic system, but it also provided something else that would end up becoming a mainstay within the franchise, an innate, ultimate attack that a protagonist could use to deal massive damage, and it had the potential to be a game changer. Due to how it could be invoked, this became known as the Desperation Attack, a name that has since been replaced by the term Limit Break, and throughout this video, we're going to study that first iteration in more detail before taking you on an expansive journey where we explore how the Limit Break differed, and how this particular mechanic has changed across the entire franchise to become not just a mainstay, but also one of the most memorable visual spectacles that can exist within a game. Introduced as a storytelling mechanic that would allow the hero to turn the tide and fight back from adversity, the notion of the Desperation Attack has been around in various forms of media for a long time. But it wasn't until Final Fantasy VI that it would become a formal gameplay mechanic within the franchise. In this game, Desperation Attacks could be used when the character was on the brink of death, as denoted by their health being only 1/8 of their maximum and the sprite changing to have them look a bit disheveled. The only exceptions to this were Strago and Gogo, who could achieve critical status without losing health by mimicking the critical status of an enemy through the use of the Rippler lore ability. Once in the critical state, each character had the chance to call upon an innate ability that would deal a devastating magical attack to a single enemy that was also unblockable and would ignore defense. The only exceptions to this were Shadow, whose Desperation Attack could also inflict sap, and Strago and Realm, whose Desperation Attacks could instantly kill the targeted enemy, unless of course the enemy was immune to death. Perhaps due to how powerful these attacks were, even if a character was in a critical state before their next turn, there was only a 1 in 16 chance that they would be able to perform a Desperation Attack, or just over 6%. Desperation attacks could also not be performed within the first 25.6 seconds of an encounter's commencement, nor could they be used if the character was confused, had blink or invisible applied, or was afflicted by the zombie status. And it meant that due to all these potential obstacles, even though many of the moves were awesome spectacles and could seriously turn the tide of a battle, the chances of actually seeing one were rather small, and even if you did manage to use one and it didn't see the conclusion of the fight, the character would be prohibited from using another Desperation Attack in the same encounter. As thoughts moved over to Final Fantasy VII, Tetsuya Nomura, who had also been involved with Final Fantasy VI, suggested that the notion of the Desperation Attack could be expanded upon as a way of exploring each character's personality in a more unique way. Much like the Materia system, this would allow characters to select from a variety of attacks, each of which would have their own unique animation, and by adding a specific bar that would be associated with what would become known as limit breaks, they would be encouraged to try different moves out and call upon them not just when the chips were down, but whenever they just wanted to see something cool. At its core, the limit break was similar to the notion of the Desperation Attack, as to use the moves, each character would need to take damage. But the requirement of being in a critical state was removed, as was the element of luck. Instead, limit breaks became associated with emotions, and a new gauge was added that would increase to show the anger each character felt when taking damage. To highlight this, a character who was in the Fury status would see their bar grow faster, whereas a character under the Sadness status would see it grow slower. Even though each character could now learn numerous limit breaks, many were still innate, learnt by a character performing certain actions in combat, but to obtain their ultimate limit break, they would need to undergo some kind of quest to obtain a manual. When used, limit breaks would again be unblockable attacks, but they could now target multiple enemies and could be used multiple times per fight. Some were also interactive, such as Tifa's slot reels. As had been the case in Final Fantasy VI, a handful of limit breaks, such as Finishing Touch and Hammer Blow, could still inflict instant death, but their use was also expanded to not just be offensive in nature, as some limit breaks could provide restorative effects. The other major thing to note is that perhaps due to that initial objective of allowing limit breaks to act as a form of expression for the playable cast, one move in particular became ingrained into the story, and whether you'd learnt it or not, Cloud would be able to perform Omnislash as his ultimate limit break in the final battle against Sephiroth as an over-the-top way of emphasising that victory had been achieved. Final Fantasy Tactics then featured some of these moves within the Limit category, which could only be accessed by Cloud and only when the Materia Blade was equipped. But they were there to pay homage to Final Fantasy VII, as opposed to being anything that mechanically resembled what was seen from Desperation Attacks in Final Fantasy VI or Limit Breaks in Final Fantasy VII. Each move could be performed at any time without any hint of desperation or the channeling of anger, and they could also be avoided due to the significant charge time that was required before each move could be performed. The next game to evolve the concept of limit breaks was Final Fantasy VIII, and this was done by combining what was seen in Final Fantasy VI and VII and introducing some new elements too. Final Fantasy VIII reverted back to having limit breaks associated with desperation, as opposed to emotional state, and it saw the removal of the limit bar. However, unlike Final Fantasy VI, where the probability of desperation attacks appearing was quite low, in Final Fantasy VIII it felt much more common due to the introduction of a hidden stat known as Crisis Level. Instead of just looking at a character's health and having the limit command be focused around whether a certain single threshold had been hit, Crisis Level took into consideration a character's health, the number of fellow party members who'd been KO'd, and the number of negative status ailments that a character had been afflicted with. By introducing this extra layer, Final Fantasy VIII was not only more adaptive, it also created more cinematic battles that tapped into player emotions. And because there were multiple crisis levels, the mechanics allow for limit breaks to deal more damage if the situation faced by the character was more desperate. There were still barriers, however, as not only was the limit command still bound by probability, it could also not be used when a character was cursed. But on the flip side, the appearance of the command could be influenced by skipping turns and by using the very powerful Aura spell. The developers working on Final Fantasy VIII also chose to place significant focus on why the limit command evolved in Final Fantasy VII. And they did this by including much more personality in not just the moves themselves, but also how they could be acquired. Rinoa, for example, would need to find Pet Pals magazines, and Irvine would need to have access to various types of ammunition. Many characters also had interactive elements to their limit breaks, with Squall requiring perfect timing, and Zell requiring the player to input various commands within a specific time limit. Quistis also absorbed the Blue Mage role into her limit break. And with Squall taking the concept of the limit break even further by having an ultimate move that would follow the first part of the limit break called Renzokuken, even though Final Fantasy VII was, for many, what established the notion of the limit break, Final Fantasy VIII was just as crucial for creating the blueprint that many games that followed would call upon. Final Fantasy IX then used some of these elements to create a hyper-focused version of the limit break known as Trance. Unlike the previous games, Trance was woven into the story of Final Fantasy IX, and it was done by building upon the emotional association established in Final Fantasy VII in significant fashion. Final Fantasy VII centered around anger being a driving force behind why the characters could perform these superhuman moves, but Final Fantasy IX broadened its horizons by making trance related to emotions in general. As such, there were numerous instances throughout the story where characters would enter heightened emotional states, leading to them entering trance. But due to this narrative device, the actual application of the limit break saw significant change. Outside of these narrative-influenced segments, trance could be initiated once the trance bar was full, and like in Final Fantasy VII, the bar would increase upon taking damage. It could also be influenced to feel faster by using the High Tide ability, but when it was full, the player had no choice about whether they'd actually want to make use of this innate power, it would be automatic. When in trance, each player would see an increase in their stats and any negative status ailments would be removed, but outside of that, there was no uniform approach to what a character could do when they were in trance mode, and there was no notion of an ultimate technique, as had been seen within Final Fantasy VII and VIII in different formats. Zidane could access a new array of moves, which could be learnt alongside skills, but many other characters simply saw their existing moves enhanced, their application improved, or their regular stats boosted by an even greater amount. All things considered, it meant that even though trance produced some awesome moments throughout the story of Final Fantasy IX, its wider influence was quite limited due to how the developers chose to implement its usage outside of those Hollywood moments. The next major iteration, Final Fantasy X, retained the limit break mechanic, but chose to call them overdrives, something that further removed them from that initial idea of moves being used in desperate times. The separate bar of Final Fantasy VII and IX returned, but it could now be filled by 17 different criteria, and it was down to the player to choose which one they would like. They could, for example, choose to have the bar fill up by the traditional criteria of taking damage, but they could also choose to have it fill up when the character evaded an attack, when an enemy was defeated, or even automatically at the start of every turn. Overdrives could target multiple or single enemies and could be used multiple times per fight, and what each character could perform was a mishmash of everything that had been seen from Final Fantasy VII through IX, with Wakka using slot reels, Yuna having her Aeons enhanced, and Kimahri's overdrive pulling from blue magic. Perhaps the biggest evolution though, outside of the variety of ways overdrives could be channeled, was that overdrives did not just apply to the playable characters. Aeons could also use them, and this was how their normal summon moves like Hellfire and Diamond Dust could be accessed. Perhaps due to its massively multiplayer base, even though Final Fantasy XI featured the concept of limit breaks, the approach was much less orthodox. After their introduction in Final Fantasy VI, every game that followed had associated limit breaks with specific characters as a unique way of highlighting their personality through gameplay. It meant the limit breaks were always tied to the character, but due to Final Fantasy XI having literally hundreds of thousands of main characters, the developers realized that the typical approach wouldn't make much sense, as it would be impossible to create a dynamic enough moveset to offer the same kind of personal connection. For that reason, they chose to have limit breaks associated with not just the weapon a character wielded, but also their job class, and each instance was aligned with one of the two themes, desperation and emotion. Borrowing from a mechanic that received a lot of scrutiny when it was used in Final Fantasy II, the developers decided to have weapon skills unlocked as proficiency increased, and the only way to increase proficiency was to use a weapon in combat. The first weapon skill could be unlocked when proficiency reached level 5, and numerous other skills could be obtained as proficiency increased, with one of the strongest always requiring a quest to be completed before it could be accessed. Although it should be noted that stronger weapon skills were added as the game expanded, many of which were based on the actual weapon itself as opposed to proficiency. To use a weapon skill, players would need to amass tactical points, which much like other games in the past that aligned limit breaks to emotion, could be generated by either taking damage or dealing damage. Once the bar reached 100%, a weapon skill could be performed, and this was where a major evolution was introduced. Unlike previous games, where once the bar was filled there was only one outcome, in Final Fantasy XI, the player could choose to carry on building the bar all the way up to 300%, something that would lead to any weapon skill used dealing much more damage and having an increased critical strike chance. Final Fantasy XI also evolved the system by allowing weapon skills to be combined, and if the correct combination were used within the right time frame, not only would the damage of each subsequent weapon skill be increased, but they also made the target vulnerable to magic bursts. Acting alongside this was the unique special job ability. At launch, this could only be used every 2 hours, and it was more aligned with the desperation aspect of limit breaks. Due to how infrequently the special job ability could be used, they were often saved up until situations were quite dire due to their incredible power and ability to have a severe influence on the outcome of a battle. Benediction, for example, would act as a white mage's get out of jail free card. At no cost of MP, it had the ability to instantly heal all allies within the area of effect and remove all negative status ailments. It meant that even though there were significant mechanical changes to how limit breaks operated across weapon skills and special job abilities, at its core, Final Fantasy XI was very faithful to the underlying principle of the mechanic. Not only that, perhaps due to the change in genre, the developers of Final Fantasy XI were also able to evolve the concept of the limit break in a natural manner by allowing for combinations and the ability to delay its use, something that could enhance the power of the move that followed. Even though Final Fantasy X-2 served as a direct sequel to Final Fantasy X, the decision was taken to develop a brand new combat system that would be focused primarily on the ATB systems that had preceded Final Fantasy X, as opposed to the CTB system that was used to such great effect. As such, the overdrive system was dispensed with, and a new system was developed that would have similarities to the trance system seen in Final Fantasy IX. Each of the 3 characters could access a special dress sphere once they had activated every node on their garment grid, which was quite a unique way of accessing the limit break. Once achieved, the character would immediately enter a heightened state that would offer increased attributes, as well as a new suite of abilities that were exclusive to that dress sphere. Final Fantasy X-2 also offered a major evolution. Unlike Final Fantasy IX's trance state, where everything was available in an instant and there was no cherry on the top, so to speak, once in the special dress sphere, each character could perform a unique ability to deal massive damage at the cost of an entire ATB bar. Before Crisis served as the next chronological release, and perhaps due to its connection with Final Fantasy VII, the use of the limit break was reserved for a story moment. In the final battle against Zirconade, the player would need to awaken a power inside them to achieve victory, and the game could only be completed after unleashing the Limit command, a direct reference to the final fight against Sephiroth. Advent Children, which was released not too long after, featured the limit break mechanic in similar fashion. Many characters did use limit break moves from the original game throughout the movie, but the clearest form of an Advent Children specific limit break happened right at the end of the movie, as Cloud was engulfed in a blue aura before using Omnislash version 5 to defeat Sephiroth yet again. DIRGE's CERBERUS, another property associated with the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, repeated a similar mechanic, as at the end of the experience, Vincent entered into his ultimate form, Chaos. But throughout the core experience, Vincent could also transform into the Galleon Beast through a brand new mechanic, using an item called the Limit Breaker. After being used, Vincent would enter into a heightened state, and similar to Final Fantasy IX and X-2, his attributes would be enhanced to allow for faster movement and an increase to damage. For the next major installment into the franchise, Hiroyuki Ito worked with a team of battle planners and designers to shake the foundations of what had been established throughout the previous decade. It saw the quintessential active time battle system replaced by the active dimension battle system, and gambits were introduced alongside the license board in an effort to give players much more control over how their party was developed, as well as what actions they could perform in combat. It led to numerous changes under the hood, and limit breaks did not escape this wave of change. Now known as quickenings, they could be purchased via the license board, and up to 3 could be purchased for each character. But unlike every prior game, the ability to perform a quickening was not inherently tied to entering a state of desperation or having an arbitrary bar fill up due to the outpouring of emotion. Instead, to perform a quickening, the character would need to expend all of their MP, at least in the original release, and this introduced the notion of sacrifice to limit breaks. Upon sacrificing all their MP, each character had the potential to unleash powerful magical attacks that could be chained to deal increased damage. Much like in Final Fantasy XI, multiple characters could also join to enhance the combination, and time played a role again. At the end of a quickening chain, if the player had performed well enough, they could also perform a finishing move called a concurrence, something that cemented the mechanics of a finishing move existing at the end of a limit break. As Revenant Wings acted as a continuation of Final Fantasy XII, even though the genre changed, many of the core mechanics were retained and altered. Quickenings was one such mechanic, and what was seen bore almost no resemblance to what was seen within the main game, but it did pull from many prior games to be an incredibly faithful rendition of the move. Due to the simplified nature of the experience, only one quickening could be learned by each character, and the method of acquisition was changed to be tied to defeating various espers. Revenant Wings also dispensed with the MP sacrifice mechanic, reverting back to a traditional gauge that needed to be filled, with each character having a unique requirement that was tied to their personality. Vaughn, for example, would have his bar filled when enemies were defeated, whereas Bash would have his bar increase upon being struck. To build on this concept, quickenings also had multiple utilities, while others could heal or enhance the party. In the final entry to what has become known as the first phase of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, it was only fitting that Crisis Core would reinvent the limit break system to create something rather unique. The digital mindwave system was like nothing ever seen before. Many previous systems had built upon the notion of connecting limit breaks to the emotions of a character, but they were often quite limited, such as being linked to the character getting angry upon being hit. Final Fantasy X expanded this concept by introducing many different ways the overdrive bar could be filled, but it was still quite one-dimensional. Crisis Core expanded all of this in significant fashion by having the digital mindwave be a visual manifestation of Zack's emotional state, as opposed to being an arbitrary bar, and this was achieved by the introduction of a luck-based slot mechanic that brought probability back into the equation, as well as the emotional gauge. The slot reels would automatically spin throughout the battle, with each spin costing 10 SP, and what happened would depend on the characters that appeared when the reels stopped spinning. If the character on the left and right were the same, this would initiate a modulating phase, something that would pull on Zack's memories and could lead to numerous scenarios, one of which was a limit break. Each limit break would be associated with a character that Zack knew, something that was used to add significant depth to Zack as a character. Because of this, his moves all had different utility, with Octoslash dealing huge damage and Healing Wave providing a huge boost to Zack as well as temporary invincibility. To add more depth to the system, the emotion gauge would influence the chance of Zack entering into a modulating state, and this was based on Zack's temperament during the fight, something that could be impacted by what was happening in the story. And this then followed a trend set by Final Fantasy VII, Before Crisis, Advent Children and Dirge of Cerberus. When Zack entered into his final stand, due to the significant emotional toll placed on the character, the DMW system would start to break, and it showed that in Crisis Core, the limit break wasn't just a bolt-on mechanic used to subtly reveal a bit of personality or deal significant amounts of damage in a huge burst. It was there, front and center, as a legitimate narrative device that enriched the development of Zack as a character.
You'll be my living legacy.
Developed as a tribute game, it made perfect sense for Dissidia to house some kind of limit break system, and it was known as EX mode. Every character would have an EX gauge, but the method for filling this gauge was quite different through the addition of EX Force. EX Force could be acquired by landing attacks or defending against them, which was similar to games that featured an emotional connection, but EX Force could also be acquired by performing chase sequences, simply moving around the arena, or by collecting EX cores. Through the addition of these methods, it made EX mode feel quite juxtaposed to the typical limit break, as instead of being performed as an act of desperation or after emotions had boiled over, EX mode was something that players sought and attempted to gain first, not to necessarily get them out of a bind, but so they could get an advantage in the fight. Limit breaks could be used in a similar fashion in many prior games. By saving them, it could be possible to start the next encounter by dealing huge amounts of damage to gain an advantage, but unlike Dissidia, that strategy was still often used as an act of desperation. In Final Fantasy X, for example, it was often the only way that people who had an aversion to grinding could actually progress through some of the harder encounters. Still, semantics aside, EX mode was quite similar to a few prior experiences as it allowed the character to enter into a heightened state. They would be granted regen, have a higher chance of landing critical strikes, and like in IX, X-2 and Dirge of Cerberus, appearance would be changed. Bonuses could also be applied, which could range from special attacks like Terra's Doublecast through to enhanced, normal attacks, and should an HP attack be landed while in EX mode, an EX burst would happen, a finisher that often paid tribute to a character's main limit break from their original game. Duodecim then used a similar mechanic, but it was rebalanced due to the assist mechanic. This saw the return of EX mode and EX burst, but it was now possible to use EX break to counter a limit break, the first time outside of tactics that a limit break could be avoided. Much like Dissidia, Final Fantasy XIII featured a combat system that was inspired by Advent Children, and to achieve this, Toshiro Tsuchida built upon the ATB system as opposed to the CTB system that he had created for Final Fantasy X. Characters had ATB gauges that were divided into different sections, and this was central to the performance of the game's limit breaks that were known as full ATB skills. Unlike many of the other games that featured limit breaks, full ATB skills were not available to characters until they approached the end of the game, as they were found deep within the Crystarian system and could not be accessed before Chapter 11. Once obtained, in similar fashion to Final Fantasy XII, where something needed to be sacrificed to use them, in Final Fantasy XIII, a character would need to expend all 6 ATB segments to use their ultimate skill. Like many previous limit breaks, full ATB skills ignored defense, which was very useful when fighting against hard enemies that were immune to either physical or magical attacks, and harkening back to some earlier games, it was not possible to use them if the character was afflicted by some negative status ailments. They were also not used automatically, so a player would need to purposefully select full ATB skill as opposed to relying on auto battle. Final Fantasy XIII-2 then featured a very similar mechanic, as Serah and Noel could learn their full ATB skills through the Crystarium system, but the major difference was that they could now only use a full ATB skill once per battle, unless they used an elixir, and that particular restriction had not been seen since Final Fantasy VI. Due to Final Fantasy XIV being another MMO, the developers decided to explore further options for how limit breaks could be used, and they ended up landing on quite a unique system that was unlike anything seen before. Up until this point, even though some games had featured limit breaks that could be combined amongst characters and players, there was always a focus on the individual. Final Fantasy XIV challenged that notion by having limit breaks only appear during instances where 4 or more party members were tackling a challenge together, and this would cause the limit break to be a shared resource. Every member of the party could see a centralized limit break gauge that would fill up gradually over time, and once full, any member of the party could initiate the limit break, but the move would be dependent on their job, and this meant that there was more utility than just dealing damage. To increase the spectacle and utility further, the limit break gauge could increase in size depending on the size of the party, with a full party complement gaining access to 2 limit gauges, and each setup would have an extra gauge added for any major boss encounters. This was the only time such a mechanic had been seen, and the amount of damage dealt would scale with the combined power of the party as opposed to the individual who used the move. It meant Final Fantasy XIV built upon the notions presented by Final Fantasy XI by making limit breaks communal as opposed to related to the individual, but there was still some room left for individuality when it came to who actually performed the move. Even though it was developed as part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis sub-franchise, Final Fantasy Type 0 didn't have too much in common with Final Fantasy XIII or its predecessor. In this game, limit breaks were known as triad maneuvers, and even though they were associated with an individual character, they could not be performed unless 3 party members were alive. After being activated, all 3 party members would team up, delivering a special move that would cost the caster's entire ability gauge. This made it quite similar to what had been seen within Final Fantasy XII and XIV, but compared to previous games, triad maneuvers weren't all that impressive as limit breaks. Limit breaks in Lightning Returns were also quite muted in their application. Lightning had one special move available to her throughout much of the experience. It was known as Army of One, and it could be used when under the effects of overclock by expending energy points, making it one of the first times where multiple requirements were laid out before access would be granted to the limit break. As Final Fantasy moved into the more modern era of mobile applications, Record Keeper led the way, and to go along with its nostalgic structure, a mechanic called Soul Break was included to pay homage to limit breaks. Each character had a default Soul Break, but this could be supplemented by certain weapons and armor, and it could be activated by using segments of the Soul Gauge. Similar to what was seen within Final Fantasy XI and XIV, due to the Soul Gauge having 6 segments, it was possible to store them up, but doing so wouldn't necessarily increase the power of the subsequent move as it did in XI. It would instead act more like Final Fantasy XIV by granting access to more powerful moves, and the most powerful of which, called Arcane Overstrikes, could only be used once per dungeon as opposed to the previous restriction of once per encounter. Final Fantasy VII G-Bike was the next game to feature limit breaks, and even though it was quite minor in the grand scheme of things, it is worth mentioning because it allowed prominent characters from Final Fantasy VII to combine their limit breaks through the unison limit break mechanic. MOBIUS adopted a rather quintessential approach to limit breaks. As in many previous games, there was a gauge associated with the move, and it could be filled by attacking, defending, or receiving damage. The rate at which these actions filled the gauge could also be manipulated in a positive manner through the use of weapon abilities, as well as the job being used by Wall, as well as in a negative way through status effects such as slow. When full, Wall would perform an ultimate, and the move performed would depend on which type of job was equipped. Each would deal considerable damage, but alongside the offensive action would also be a passive action, such as applying regen. In the next major mobile game, Brave Exvius, numerous aspects from all across the franchise were utilised. Each character had a single innate limit burst ability, and it would fall into various categories, with some offering increased damage and others providing utility through enhancements to the party or debuffs to enemies. As had been seen numerous times before, a gauge was present, but it could be filled in a variety of manners. Similar to Dissidia, burst stones could be absorbed, and these would drop when enemies were damaged, with the strength of the attack determining how many stones would become available. Some characters, such as Cloud, could use auto limit that would forgo the need to collect stones by instead increasing their bar by a set amount each turn, and this status could also be obtained by wearing special equipment or accessories. Other characters could use skills to increase their limit gauge, and the Entrust skill could even be used to fill up another party member's limit gauge. Once full, a limit burst could be performed, and as was seen in Final Fantasy VII, where performing actions could unlock more potential for a limit break, in Brave Exvius, every time a limit burst was performed, it would gain experience points. These could then be upgraded to level 30, something that would see a significant increase in their application. In more recent times, Brave Exvius even built upon this by introducing the Super Limit Burst, or Limit Shift. The next major game to feature a limit break mechanic was Final Fantasy XV, but even though it was tied to the story, it reverted back to being a more aggressive move, similar to the original Dissidia. After acquiring the first 4 royal arms, Noctis could use the Armiger. It would see him enter a new state that would increase speed and strength, make warp strikes more powerful, and actively prevent Noctis from entering into a critical state. Before the conclusion of the Armiger, Noctis could then use a finisher called the Armiger Chain, with the damage dealt related to how much of the gauge was left before being used. The Royal Edition then added Armiger Unleashed, a more powerful variant that could be used if the Founder King's sigil was equipped. This would push Noctis even further beyond his limits, breaking damage, but unlike the regular Armiger, Noctis could now enter into a critical state, and doing so would cause Armiger Unleashed to end. DISSIDIA NT saw a huge regression to the EX system, but even though Opera Omnia was similar when it launched, Chapter 11 added EX abilities, and in more recent times, Burst Mode has also been added. Due to the initial omission, EX abilities were not innate, and could only be accessed by equipping the relevant weapon. However, after upgrading a weapon by breaking its limit, the EX ability could become a permanent trait. To be able to perform an EX ability, a gauge would need to be filled by either taking damage or dealing damage, and depending on the character, the ability would vary, with some dealing damage and others providing support for the party. Burst Mode is similar in how it can be accessed, as it requires a character to have a burst relic equipped, but the application was quite different, as it would see a character enter into a heightened state where they would be given 6 consecutive turns, and it could be concluded by a finishing burst, a powerful move that could break the 99,999 damage cap. Such was its power that Burst Mode could only be used once per encounter. The latest game to feature limit breaks is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and due to the nature of the experience, the developers chose to reimagine the concept while keeping its core elements intact. Each character featured a limit gauge, and it would be filled upon taking damage, but it could now also be charged by staggering enemies. However, limit breaks could no longer be stored between battles, and the gauge would be reset at the start of each encounter unless a special accessory was being worn. As a slight compensation, unlike the original game, limit did not replace the attack command, and this allowed limit breaks to be saved until a more strategic moment presented itself. The concept of a limit break was innate to each character, but using the move had no notion of progression. Instead, each character's second limit break would need to be acquired from the Corneo Coliseum. The developers also made it so that limit breaks became part of the action as opposed to being preset. This meant the attacks could miss, and it was also possible to still be attacked and indeed have the character performing the move suffer a KO, but this mechanic was adjusted following the release of Intermission, and it will be interesting to see what further mechanics are made as the Final Fantasy VII Remake builds out in the years to come. That wraps up this evolutionary topic though. We'd love to hear your thoughts about how the concept of the limit break has evolved over the years, as well as which game you feel has featured it in the most impressive manner. So be sure to let us know in the comments below, and feel free to hit that like button if you enjoyed this latest study. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Rainy Eckham, Benjamin Snow and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.